On Laura Kuenssberg's show on Sunday morning on BBC One on Sunday, they were debating net zero, and it wasn't a balanced panel. It was Chris Packham, Layla Moran, and Luke Johnson. But Luke Johnson, entrepreneur, bit of a climate contrarian, at least was able to put the kind of alternative point of view when they were talking about net zero. And at one point, Chris Packham started banging on about extreme weather events. I think the context was that Luke was saying that ordinary people will be paying the price for net zero in terms of increased energy bills, having to cope with the cold and so forth, cars that don't work properly because they're EVs. And Chris Packham shot back with, well, what about the ordinary people in Dubai who've suffered these downpours in the last couple of weeks and flooding? What about the ordinary people of Mali who've been suffering from these extraordinary heat waves? What about them? And Luke said, well, show me the evidence that those extreme weather events are linked to, the burning of fossil fuels, to carbon emissions. And at that point, Chris Packham got quite angry, and he said, well, you certainly won't find that evidence in Toby Young's Daily Sceptic. And he
Nice.
he said, which is put together by people with close connections to the fossil fuels industry. He says, if you want the evidence, it's called science.
Nice.
The BBC Politics then clipped this and put it out on Twitter, and Laura Kuenssberg retweeted it, and at last count it had something like 850,000 views, and it's just straight out misinformation. None of the people who put together the Daily Sceptic have any connections to the fossil fuel industry. It's typical of the ad hominem way in which the defenders of net zero go about trying to prosecute their case, rather than engage in actual argument, rather than actually present Luke Johnson with any evidence that extreme weather events are linked to the burning of fossil fuels. He just immediately accused those who ask for the evidence, who challenge that hypothesis of being in the pay of big oil.
Yeah.
It's an absolutely typical move. But in this case, it's just complete balls. We're not in the pay of big oil. I sometimes wish we were in the pay of big oil. I mean, it's just, and Chris Packham himself is very quick to sue people for libel, and successfully sued the editor of, I think, Country Squire for libel. That case concluded last year, cost him millions of pounds. So for him to be so incautious in spreading about these completely malicious, false smears about the Daily Sceptic seems pretty extraordinary. And then for the BBC to then promote these without even checking them. The BBC set up BBC Verify last year, supposedly to tackle the kind of growing threat of disinformation. And here's the BBC putting out this clip on Twitter, which contains absolutely naked, straight up misinformation about the Daily Sceptic. I think I'm going to make a complaint to the BBC about it.
Well, you should do more than that. A couple of things. You said fossil fuel there, but yeah, I think he did say oil industry, and that sounds quite grand and like there might be money involved. So I was thinking, Chris Packham needs to see who actually is involved in the Daily Sceptic. It's just a bunch of harmless oddballs. It really is. It's Will, nice guy, you know what I mean? Wife's a vicar. These are not people with ties to big oil. I've contributed to it. Loner, former comedian, just nothing to do with big oil. Would love to be. There's a bunch.
He said, I quote, evidence doesn't come from Toby Young's Daily Sceptic, which is basically put together by a bunch of professionals with close affiliations to the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, that's what he said.
What's my affiliation to the fossil fuel industry?
It's a bunch of harmless oddballs who are trying to do something good in the world, and absolutely non-fossil based people. And you should sue him. I saw people saying you should sue him.
Well,
and you should.
I'm slightly reluctant to kind of reach for Britain's libel laws.
You've got the Free Speech Union.
What
are you doing? What are you doing about it? You've got a whole company. Company you can sue one company you can defend one company with the other company.
I think the risk of
conflict of interest.
The risk of suing him is that it would paint a big target on the Daily Sceptic's back, and if we ever get anything wrong when talking about the involvement of various green billionaires in the kind of net zero propaganda machine, they would immediately sue us for libel. They say, well, all bets are off now. He sued Chris Packham for libel, let's get him. So I think that would be risky and could end in the Daily Sceptic being shut down. I think better to submit a complaint to the BBC, and I think it's a complaint they'd have to take seriously, because not only was it on a BBC programme and the BBC tweeted it, but in addition, Chris Packham is an ex-BBC presenter and he's got a BBC programme he's presenting coming up. So it really did, this slur, this completely false smear has the imprimatur of the BBC. So I think they'll take the complaint seriously, and hopefully they'll have to, at the very least, apologise for it.
And then there's the emotional pain that you felt. I've seen how upset you've been about it. You've been distraught.
The funny thing is...
It's the first time I've seen you cry. I didn't even know you could.
The funny thing is that all these kind of publications that are in the same trench as Chris Packham immediately hailed this as an incredibly eloquent and brilliant, mic drop moment on Chris Packham's part. So the Canary said, Chris Packham just humiliated Kuenssberg's preposterous climate-denying guest. Another publication, which I'd never heard of, admittedly, called The London Economic, which describes itself as a digital newspaper with a metropolitan mindset. Shock. Nice. It said, with science on his side, Chris Packham was able to deliver a devastating put-down when challenged on the evidence of climate change. I can't help feeling it would have been even more devastating had one iota of it actually been true. I mean...
Yeah, it was shocking. Also, he seems to be going for a bit of a Dan Mutton style, the Daily Sceptic. It's like a classic sly news, slippery style. It's like the Daily Sceptic. It's genius. He took out a letter, and thus you were, ensnared on the sword of his wit. I mean, shocking stuff. Impaled, I meant.
Yeah, I've written about it for for my Spectator column this week. I mean, I think it's part of a larger pattern amongst defenders of these kind of radical progressive policies. Instead of actually engaging in debate, instead of defending those policies, setting out the case for those policies, they just try and smear their opponents or pretend that they're so well supported by the science or the facts that no serious person could possibly disagree. There's this extraordinary reluctance to actually enter into a proper grown-up debate about these issues. And you begin to suspect, well, maybe it's because they're not terribly confident that their position is actually defensible.
You'd hope it could be that. I mean, really, he should just go to the Daily Sceptic website and, it should be a compliment, Toby, that he thinks that's funded by Big Fossil, does he really? I mean, it's good, but does he really look at the Daily Sceptic and think this has massive backing? It seems like a fairly, small passion-based project to me when I look at it. Even though it's good, I just think, I don't think Big Fossil when I see it particularly. But I love that they always think we're funded all the time.
Yeah, and it's a favourite go-to argument for George Monbiot too. Whenever anyone criticises his absolute kind of zealous green eco fanaticism, he immediately accuses them of being funded by big oil, rather than actually try and defend his position, set out the argument for net zero. He just immediately reaches for, Tufton Street, you're funded by big oil.
When you're morally superior, Toby, and your argument is unimpeachable, you don't need debate. You just need to say big oil.
I think one. I mean, maybe I'm being too charitable in assuming they're just not very confident that they could actually defend their position in a straight-up fair fight. Maybe they think, well, why do we need to bother? Because even if your side wins elections, we're still going to be in charge. So we didn't need to bother with these kind of trivial democratic debates. Election results are meaningless. We'll be in control. So who cares if we lose the argument at the public square? We're not even going to waste our time waging it.